Hello, Jane. Jane, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Excellent. How's everything?
Oh, it's just fine. How's it with you?
Everything's fine. I'm just so intrigued by this topic. I want to thank you for picking what I think is one of the interesting characters we've been talking about so far. In I'd say powerful women, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll define it. I guess I should post it as a question, right? I mean, would she be a powerful person, or was it um, more of a manipulation act by everybody,
Well,
including, yeah, go ahead.
she was definitely Queen of England. She definitely did what she did. The whole problem is the topic is there's too much drama in it. You know, from every single angle, from the queerness of her marriage all the way up to the invasion, up to the Battle of Bannockburn. And it it's just so complicated.
Yeah, so you want to I know we always have technical issues. Just want to see if you you want to post up your presentation and see if everything works. We're
Oh,
about to,
sure.
yeah, we
Uh,
usually give people, and what I do in meantime while you do that, I have a little poll going, but it's never ending with this, with this, and I'll post some of the other questions that people may answer, and but I just want to, obviously some of them are pretty obvious, so uh, if people want to take Paul and let me know what they think about these questions, and that, you know if there's a
uh-huh.
spell if there's a spelling mistake, I mean, you can take care of, let's take care of the technical issues, and while we're people are taking polls so that they have fun while we're having fun.
Okay, so I need to be able to share my screen.
Yep,
And
go ahead, share.
the trouble is that right now, I have something that says join a meeting, but I'm already here. And if I try to close that out, it takes me out of Zoom, or at least it tries to
See if you can join the meeting.
join a meeting. Okay,
Yeah.
won't do it. And then they say sign up.
Oh, because you don't have Zoom, probably. You're
I
using the
do, I do, I do, I do, I do. And then it says verify your age. Good God. Can I
No, no.
lie?
Okay, well, why don't you get out completely and come back?
Okay.
Uh,
Oh, go away. Won't close. Already have an account. Sign in. Okay, let's try
mhm.
that. Then it says enter your email,
Yeah, yeah. You know any of that stuff?
newladyshot@gmail.com.
And then your password. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't used my password in like 30 years. I do have one. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, okay. Where are we?
So I
Okay.
think I encourage people to take the poll while we're taking care of the technical
Good,
issue.
good, good.
I guess the first question I just wanted to read while you're getting that. So while you're getting that sign in, let me know. But you know what? Gmail should memorize, or if you're using Chrome, it should memorize your password. So if you put your email, it should pop up the password immediately.
First of all, I'm obviously here because I'm talking to you.
Right.
Secondly, I always sign in with Google. So I've
Now,
never been asked for a password before.
yeah. And so what happens if you the application? Is there a button somewhere on the bottom? It should pop up the because you're a co-host. It should pop
Uh-huh.
up. It should pop up the.
Which it says I'm not getting the meeting at all. All I'm getting is the list of people who are signed up.
Okay, well, get out of that.
Okay, leave. That'll take me right out. I'll try signing in again. Leave meeting.
Yeah. Let's see how we're doing on the poll. Only one person took the poll. So if you guys want to take the poll, interesting questions. So the first question is, do you think Isabella had a right to install Edward III, which is her son, to English throne and rule with who she had a her third she had a lover. And then second question, do you think Edward II had a love affair with Piers Garrison? And the third one, how would you define the relationship of Edward III, her son, with mother Isabella? Let's see. All. Let me make Jane a co-host. Hi, Jane. Jane. Jane, can you hear me?
I'm there. Okay. I'm now unmuted.
Okay. Well, because you're co-host, you should have all the rights I have.
Uh-huh. Okay, good.
So now you see share.
It just says start video. Maybe that's it.
Start the video. Well, it just shows you. Yeah, perfect. And then now start. You see share on the bottom.
I do not see share.
So there should be some kind of tool panel on the bottom where you see participants, chat.
No. It won't. Let's see.
It's gotta be a tool panel. What computer do you use? Is this Apple?
Oh, okay, I got it. I got it. I fooled around and I got it. Share screen. You want me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. And let's see if what do I do to share screen now?
You can either share the screen or you can share your presentation only. So you should give you do you see your presentation when you say share screen? It should pop up your presentation. Or you could just share a screen, which is the first one on the left.
Wait a second. Um,
Let me see how we're doing on the poll. We have 3 people. So today's presentation would be on Queen Isabella, who infamously was married to Edward II, who obviously the family had the throughout the years, Edward's family had redefined Plantagenets, redefined the history of England. And what's interesting is, right, Edward the second was related to his father. The nickname was Longshank because he was tall, presumably over 6 feet, something like that. That's why he was called Longshank. So if you can take a poll, just kind of like to see where people have different interests. Even if you don't know anything, just take it for the sake of it. And then there's going to be additional questions I might be posting through our chat if people are interested. you know, we'll talk about obviously Edward's cousin, who tried to um, who tried to make sure that Piers Gaveston gets separated from Edward II, and make sure that Edward II rules England instead of running around with presumably his lover. I don't know how true it is. But so what's going on, Jay? You pulled it up?
Well, I've shared my screen and I have the right thing up, so you should be able to see it.
I don't see a screen.
Oh. Let's go back to they want my password. So I have to find the password, which should be right about here. And that is.
We usually start about 7 minutes into the presentation. We always ask people where you guys are from, what which state or country, just to kind of gauge our demographics. Who do we present to? Maybe some people are from England and obviously interested in Plantagenet history and whatnot. One of the interesting questions, if you want to drop the answer, what language do you think people spoke in England around that time? You could, the three answers, could be English, French, Norman, or some kind of combination of English, French. I mean, what do you think was the prevalent language in England at the time? We're talking about 13th century, 14th century. Obviously we know the whole story of Richard the Lionheart. I mean, I don't even know if he ever actually made it to England, but he was very famous English knight who presumably had a relationship with Saladin, and almost married Saladin's. Saladin was offered Richard's sister. Jay, what's going on? We're just taking care of some technical issues.
Well, they're supposed to send me my password, so I'm waiting for my password to show up in my mail. They have never, ever asked me for my password before.
So you tried to share and they're asking you a password? I'm the one that starting the meeting. I don't know why they're asking for your password.
No. To sign in, apparently I'm not on Zoom. They asked me to get into Zoom before they show me anything of the meeting except everybody's face.
I see.
And so I'm looking for my password.
All right, we're getting it in right now.
Oh, let me try again.
Okay.
Wait.
We're going to up in a minute. So let's see how we're doing on a poll. 4 people had taken it. Interesting answers, yeah. Obviously.
Here we go.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're going to be running in a second.
In a few minutes, I hope. Few seconds, I hope.
Few seconds, okay. And I want to thank Jane. She had done some really interesting characters. We have. Okay, so let me just. What is this?
Sign in.
Okay.
Almost.
Nice. So if you want to drop your answers to let me know what language did um, I guess did people speak in England in 14th century? Oops, sorry. I think I want to post that to everybody. Okay, and I'll monitor and admit people as they come. Able to share?
Not yet. Why don't I click here to change your password? Sorry, your password link expired. Well,
So while Jane is getting this on, I want to talk about some of our upcoming programs that we have.
why don't you let me start this? And the only thing you can't see is the slides at the moment. So let me get started. And then when there's a break, I can play around with the password thing.
Okay, sure. Also, why don't you email it to me? Maybe I can share it on my end.
Oh, that's a very good idea.
Excellent.
And your email file, share. Okay, I can share. Okay. Jack, what's your email?
It's you can use Zakar, ZAKHAR 40.
Again, slowly.
Z is in zebra, A is in apple, K is in Kate, H is in head.
Okay, I got it at Hotmail, right?
Yes.
Okay, you should have it at the Hotmail address.
I have to log into my computer, but you can start. Go ahead. And then I'll pull up the slides in a second.
Okay. Queen Isabella of England, actually of France. It makes it very confusing because if you start to research her, you're going to find Isabella of Castile and practically anybody else Isabella in the world, but she's actually Isabella of France, Queen of England. So welcome to another of my talks on powerful women who got that way by being, in the British phrase, no better than they should be. This time, the subject is known as Isabella of France, which is confusing if you try to look her up, because she was the Queen of England. There is a trigger warning. There is a lot of high drama in this tale. There's queer sex and messy executions. I apologize, but that is history. Because the tale of Isabella is set at a time when there were lots of literate people, clergy and otherwise, busy chronicling the facts as someone told them, naturally they have their disagreements. If you have a different version of anything in this talk, please speak up in the breaks or put it in the chat. It's difficult to impossible to find accurate representations of what 13th to 14th century people looked like. Most of the drawings available were made a century or so later. The source nearest to reality are tomb effigies. These were at least made by contemporary sculptors who might have worked from life or death if it came unexpectedly in youth. They were not at all flattering, though. Here's one of Edward. And if you've got the slide, show slide 3.
No, I'm still pulling out my computer. I haven't got the slides yet.
Okay, so slide 1 is a picture of Isabella, but it's a drawing, and of course, it's probably not contemporary, and it's probably nothing like she looked at. Slide 2 is actually from a column in a cathedral, and it's supposed to be Isabella herself, and it may well be, but I also see it listed on Google Images as Madame de Pompadour, which it probably isn't. So a little vague, but slide 3, which you should be looking at now, is actually Edward from his tomb effigy. So that's what he looked like. Isabella had an eventful life. She led a successful invasion of England, the first since Stephen's in 1141 and only the third since William the Conqueror. She deposed the King of England, who happened to be her husband. She was born in 1292 or maybe 1295 and had a sister and 4 brothers, 3 of whom became kings of France. And that would be slide 4 comes now, which is Philip and his family. And Isabella is the one in the red dress to Philip's right. Okay. A little background. The structure of power in the various countries of Europe was still feudal. Parts within the boundaries of one country could be administered and taxed by another country. You know all this, but I'm talking from maybe the one person in the room who doesn't. Each country was divided into counties, so named in England, and headed by noblemen, that is, earls, dukes, and so forth, who were supposed to pay homage for their lands to the king. They were also supposed to supply him with soldiers on demand, because the king couldn't afford a private standing army. That was how it was supposed to work, but the real power was in the hands of the nobles. That is, if they united, which they would do if the king was sufficiently greedy and incompetent. The misgovernment had to be off scale because they were more often than not fighting with one another. In 1215, 40 barons had united to oppose King John, and a Magna Carta was the result. Popes and bishops were also powerful and had a lot of cash and real estate. 1/3 of all England by the time of Henry VIII, and their support had significant effect on the equilibrium of power. Isabella has received a lot of attention, especially in recent years, due to the sexuality of her husband, Edward II. Christopher Marlowe wrote a play about him. Now, if 1/10 of the documented or imputed events of Marlowe's life were actually true, he wins the Oscar for most flamboyant, in every sense, playwright of the Elizabethan era. And in that play, Edward II's sexuality is front and center. The groundlings took it in stride and slapped each other's backs and howled at all the bawdy jokes. The first church penalties for same-sex activity date from the Conference of Nablus in 1120 in Jerusalem. The penalties for males were set at a 1-year penance for first offense and castration and burning, that's all, for repeat offenders. Secular laws followed. Chaucer, who was a contemporary of Isabella, had no problem with the subject, slyly referring to his partner as either a gelding or a male, that is, either a eunuch or a male acting sexually as a female.
Question regarding the Edward II. Is that confirmed that he had relations with Galveston, or this is just evil dukes saying that?
Well, if it was evil dukes, it must be 98% of them and half the population of England. I think that was pretty sad and well known.
But I guess the second question, Stams, is what is Isabella? How did she, was involved in this menage a trois, so to speak.
No, it was a menage a deux because Isabella was out of it for some considerable time. And I will definitely get to that. Okay. So getting back to the secular laws against homosexuality. And yet, King Richard I was reported to be sharing dinner plates in a bed with King Philip II of France while he tarried there after his ransom got paid, which nearly bankrupted England. Richard had no children by his wife, Berengaria, though they were reportedly an affectionate couple. Yet chroniclers were like, yada, yada, Richard and Philip were just friends. Why they made a fuss over Edward. The Lion Heart was a hero of the Crusades, and Edward, well, we shall see. Edward's father was Philip IV, named Philip the Fair for his looks and not for his being fair. All his children and their mother, Joan of Navarre, were also thought exceptionally beautiful, although Joan was chosen more for her lands than her looks. Philip was obsessed with adding territory, which he fought for, or bought, or confiscated outright. To raise the money for his acquisitions, he reduced the weight of the gold coinage, keeping their designated names, of course, or values. He raised more by seizing the goods and money held by Jews and bankers, the easiest and most traditional of targets. By the way, Lashana Tova for everyone that is that way, including me. When that was in hello?
No, thank you.
When that was insufficient in 1306, he went after the Templars. And here we get to slide 5, which is the death of de Molay, who was the grand whatever of the Templars in France. They were organized by country. This is how it came about. Pope Boniface had issued a bull in 1301 prohibiting taxation of the clergy. Philip went ballistic and had his agents in Italy arrest the Pope. They treated him so badly that he died shortly afterwards. Philip played politics and got a pro-French cardinal elected to succeed him. And that is why I'm going into this, because it's important and for us. In 1305, he moved the papacy to Avignon. This Pope protested not at all when 1 year later, Philip arrested the Templars, tortured them to obtain confessions to a basket of criminal acts, including homosexuality, seized the possession of the order, and burned 50 of the survivors. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay, at his burning, cursed Philip with his last breaths and predicted quite accurately his death along with the Pope's within 1 year. The extermination of the French order of Templars forever canceled the debts Philip had incurred by borrowing from them in order to finance his conquests. Isabella was an intelligent child, and although she never learned Latin and was no scholar like Elizabeth I, she was fond of books, most particularly the Arthurian legends, and that becomes important too. She didn't need to learn English because the English court, as you know now, spoke French. In 1303, she was betrothed to Edward, Prince of Carnarvon. Later heirs to the throne were designated as Prince of Wales, which is where Carnarvon is. She didn't get to see de Molay burned to death because that happened in 1314, and she was married and Queen of England in 1308, but the arrest of all the Templars in 1307 caused an international sensation. She had 3 older brothers and 1 younger who probably knew of all the salacious accusations. Royal kids have lots of servants, and servants know everything. So she was acquainted with the way people can be. Isabella also learned entitlement and privilege. France was the wealthiest kingdom in Europe. The record of her trousseau included 2 gold crowns and all kinds of gold and silver tableware, for example, 50 silver porringers, besides her gowns, multiple furs, tapestries, and 419 yards of linen.
Jane, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I never got the slides. I apologize. You never sent it to me. Can you look at your other box so I can share it with people?
What? Send them again?
Yeah, you didn't send it to me.
I did. I must have sent. I sent them to your to Zach at number whatever at Hotmail, right?
No, I didn't. Nothing came. So
Oh,
it's
okay. Let me do
Z.
it again.
Yeah, you might have stopped typing my name. Maybe you should just type the whole email.
Okay.
Sorry.
Uh, history, fitness, and etc. That one.
Yeah, use that one.
Okay. Yeah, I can't make a mistake typing because you just have to click on the on the email. Do you have it yet?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. So why don't you go and we'll go through this. If you can share. Okay, here's the first slide. Are you ready for this?
I'm still not logged in. Give me 5 minutes.
Sure. Hello?
Yeah, I'm having problems, but go ahead. Continue. I'll.
Okay. All right. I'm just barely signed into Zoom right now. So let me see if I can get join. Or oh, it's I better continue talking. Okay. Isabella's wedding took place in Bologna at January 25th, 1307. Her father attended and gave a strong lecture on the groom on the subject of Gascony, a fair chunk of France at the corner of Spain and the Atlantic Ocean. England held Gascony as a vassal of the King of France, and English kings were supposed to periodically put their hands between those of the French king to do him homage, and so continue England's possession of it. Edward I didn't want to go to France, so Edward II was supposed to have gone instead. Philip reminded him that his marriage had been negotiated on condition of his performing the long overdue homage. Nonetheless, Philip gave a splendid wedding present. Edward gave all the presents to a friend of his, Piers Gaveston. Isabella was devastated. She was to be crowned in England along with her new spouse a month later. The ceremony was planned by Gaveston, and in it, he played a starring role. This too was distressing, not just to Isabella, but to all the nobles in attendance. Who was this upstart to be at the head of a procession in Westminster Abbey, carrying a sacred relic from before the conquest? Basically, nobody. His father was a Gascon knight who'd served in Edward I's army, and Piers, a promising-looking lad, was adopted by the court as a playmate for young Edward. Aware of his meager resume, the gathered peers could, that's the nobles, not Piers Gaveston, could not believe their eyes seeing him thus honored in the extreme while they were passed over. It was a humiliation that would fester, but Edward II was smitten with Piers Gaveston, who gloried in the power that this gave him. He was rude, he was arrogant, with the peerage giving them nicknames like Black Door of Arden, Burst Belly, or Joseph the Jew. King Edward, who'd been taken in at first by Gaveston's flatteries and willingness to please, became alarmed as Piers clung like a limpet to the Prince of Wales, who couldn't do without him. Edward I finally fed up, exiled him, but Gaveston was back at court and up to his old
I'm
tricks.
sharing right now, Jane. Which slide do you want me to be?
Okay, let me go back to the slides so I see. Okay, let's run through them all from the beginning very quickly, okay? Up to now. The first one, that's a drawing of Isabella. It's not exactly accurate. This one, if it's her, there's some doubt, may be accurate. Here's Edward II, her spouse, yuck. Over here is her family, and she is the one to the right of Philip, who of course is the king and the biggest one there. Now let us go on. And over here, number 5 is Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, burning to death alone with, I guess, one of the Pope. And over here, we have Isabella at her wedding. She's with Edward. She's in that gorgeous ermine-lined gown. And he's kind of looking pretty good to himself over there for once. All right, and here we have a representative of Edward and Piers Gaveston. Okay, are you with me?
Yes, when you say here, just name the slide because I'm on the slide 7.
Yeah, and they're all pretty obvious what they are. Okay, so um, Edward I became alarmed as Piers clung like a limpet to the Prince of Wales, who couldn't do without him. Finally, he got fed up and exiled him, but Gaveston was back at court and up to his old tricks after Edward I died a few months later. Edward II, unfettered, named him Earl of Cornwall. The new distinction only made him worse. After the coronation, a festive meal had been set in the abbey, and of course, Piers had planned it, and everyone waited hours before the food finally came. The drama of the coronation and Piers' turn on center stage was over, so he hadn't paid much attention to this part. When dinner came, it was cold and the food was raw and spoiled. It was a metaphor of how England would be governed under Edward II. When Isabella returned with her ladies late that night, her first as Queen of England, she found much of her glorious trousseau had disappeared. Edward had looted it and given the spoils to Gaveston. After her ladies retired, she spent the remainder of the night alone in bed in tears. This wasn't because she was considered too young for intercourse. We extend childhood a lot more than people did a long time ago because they might not live that long anyway. Empress Wu joined Taizong's harem at the age of 12. Mary, Queen of Scots' marriage to Prince Francois took place when she was 15, and the wedding night consummation was witnessed by the king to ensure there was no barrier to the production of an heir. He reported that they jousted well. Isabella's ladies would have given her a crash course in what to expect and assured her that she would come to enjoy it. Nobody was reticent about sex in those days. Nothing changed for Isabella as time went on. The queen of any country had one job, to produce an heir, and Isabella couldn't do it by herself. Neither Piers nor Edward were exclusively gay. Piers had a girl by his wife, Marguerite de Clare, a relative of the Earl of Gloucester. Edward had fixed him up with her and given Piers his earldom to qualify him for the marriage. At some point during the years 1305 to 1310, Edward is reputed to have had an illegitimate son. Edward was overfond of gambling and drank to excess. Boy, what a husband. His gifts to Piers were bankrupting the country, already stressed financially from countering the threats from Scotland and Wales. A child was at last born to Isabella on November 13, 1312. The boy would become Edward III, one of the most popular of English kings for his military triumphs, not at all like his father. I wonder how that came about. Edward did have a son, as we said, but he wasn't having sexual intercourse with Isabella, even then. She wrote exactly that in a letter to her brother Charles. If the baby had resulted from a clandestine affair, Edward would have known and very happily popped her into prison or a convent. Edward was already in deep doo-doo. The nobles were having a moment of unity unprecedented since Magna Carta. Edward had appropriated lands from them, set their father's wills aside. King Philip was protesting the treatment of his daughter. Isabella was poor. Edward hadn't given her her dower. That's the presents that he was supposed to give her at the marriage, or a penny since their marriage. A spy reported that Philip sent 40,000 English pounds to two of the earls opposing it. Isabella knew about the spies. She too was spied on. To thwart them, she would make a one-day pilgrimage to Canterbury, ostensibly to pray to St. Thomas of Becket, martyred for opposition to his king, by the way, but actually to send letters to France through the informal diplomatic couch used by the church. Isabella was growing up and she was learning to fight back. And I've always wondered if she didn't use the strategy that Catherine the Great used to produce an heir. Catherine, the Grand Duke, was ignoring her, and she had to have an heir. And finally, there was a message from the Empress, and the message was given to an intermediary so she could deny it. And there were two names, and she had to pick one. And there was a lovely romantic affair with this one. She has it all written in her memoirs, which she wrote. And the heir was provided, and nobody said boo. Could it be here? Anyway, now in 1308, the nobles, Pope and Philip, demanded the exile of Piers Gaveston. The Pope threatened Piers with excommunication if he returned. To keep Piers as close as possible, Edward appointed him Lieutenant of Ireland, where he commenced a brutal suppression of the Irish rebels, thankfully short, since he was back in London in less than a year. Edward had spread a lot of England's cash around. Okay, and then let's look at the next slide, which is slide 8. This is the next step. It was huge. In 1310, Parliament appointed a council of 21 from among the nobles and bishops as ordainers to set limits on Edward's freewheeling parody of government. The ordinances of 1311 listed 40 of these limits, and it was made clear that Edward would either sign it or be deposed. The ordinances began their indictment of the king, blamed on evil counselors, of course, for his inability to deal with the deteriorating situation and the possibility of rebellion due to his land seizures and taxation. Edward was forbidden to appoint officials without prior approval by Parliament. He couldn't go to war without their consent. His first half-hearted sortie towards Scotland was a disaster and an expensive one. He couldn't even leave the country except by applying for their permission. He was prohibited from raising money by taking gold off the coinage. Taxes and other revenues had to be deposited directly in the treasury without a slimming detour through the king's accounts. Parliament, at this time, a meeting of the barons called on occasion to advise the king, was to convene yearly. Gaveston was to be exiled, not just from England, but from Ireland and the Marches. That's the Welsh part of it as well. And here we have
Jane, which slide am I on? 8?
You were correctly on 8. I can see it. And now if you want to go to 9, these are the signatures of the, yeah.
Let me ask you a question. So sure. The person that tried to depose him, obviously due to the fact that the Gaveston and him had a love affair, the Lancaster, this cousin, right? The Duke of Lancaster.
He was the one. It wasn't one person. He was the most powerful earl in England. He had 5 earldoms. Nobody else ever did, and he joined all of these people. I think his signature is in there. The rest of it can't read because it's in French unless you read French. But go ahead.
So what's interesting is recently I've watched some documentary in archives in London. They actually have a name of Gaveston on this deposition, which is interesting. Who the hell is he? He's just a knight from France that presumably won a couple of matches here and there, but nothing important. That's why I was just to understand, like, were they really obsessed the fact that he wasn't ruling and he was going around, parading this, his lover? What was the whole thing, or is it because they just wanted the power and this was just one of the excuses?
It was a cluster situation. Nobody would have minded if he had just kept it in bed, because nobody minded with Richard the Lionheart either. But the fact is that he was obnoxious. He was expensive. Edward never stopped giving him stuff, and sometimes that was their lands and so forth. He was incompetent as a soldier. He had already made a mess of an expedition to Scotland, and those things are expensive. And Scotland was really a major threat. I mean, you can see a movie about William Wallace. I think that was made. As far as Robert the Bruce was more than competent at killing Englishmen and setting things on fire. What's to love?
Yeah, there was an interesting part of that movie where Edward is obviously with his lover, and that's when his father was still around, and he was trying to make a man out of him, right? So he would come into the room and threw Edward's lover when he was, younger. Obviously, it wasn't Galveston, out of the window because the guy was trying to give him, kingly advice how to deal with William Wallace and stuff. That was just interesting aspect of that movie.
Oh, I wish I'd seen it.
The brave heart, yeah.
Oh, yes, I did see it. Oh, yes. I'm not a fan of Mel Gibson, though. Yeah, okay. So, did I answer your question?
It was interesting. And as a Jewish person, what was his, not Edward's his son, and during this time, like, I mean, we know obviously during his son when the Jews were kicked out of England and they were accused of a number of things, poisoning the water with normal blood libel, all that crap that Nazis had built. But just interesting. What was this hatred toward Jews at that time? I mean, later on, Shakespeare and the Merchant of Venice, and also mentioning, a lot of anti-Semitism going on. I can imagine there's so many Jews living in 14th century England right now. I mean, yeah.
I forget who kicked the Jews out of England.
Edward III. Edward III.
It was who?
Edward III, his son.
Oh, it was Edward III. So you can see, I mean, there must have been a lot mounting up. And it was all over the place.
Okay, I understand. Maybe it's just the question. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so I will move on a little bit here. Yeah. So Edward signed the ordinances on September 27, 1311. Edward III was born November 13, 1312. Allowing time for a couple of blanks in the standard 9 months, it does look as if Edward really needed to prove he could do something right, even if someone had to prove it for him. It may be hard to perform when fear is the only motivation. And I already gave you the analogy that may have happened with Catherine the Great. It's only my imagination, but I have a good one. Anyway, to placate Philip, Edward finally gave the Queen 2 counties to provide an income and gifted her with a manor or two, as well as a castle of her own, which she promptly fortified with a new buttressed wall. Gaveston was sent to his native Gascony, from which he bounced, securing a safe conduct through France. I don't know how. Gaveston returned to England because Gaveston and France were two kind of different places administratively. Edward commandeered Scarborough Palace near York, and Piers joined him there. Isabella was instructed to follow through what was basically a civil war, as the Ordainers raised troops to chase down their king. Now we get to Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was in command of them. Also on the march, perhaps less forcefully motivated, was the Earl of Pembroke and his armed contingent. Forced to flee Scarborough, Edward redirected Isabella to Tynemouth Priory, while he escaped to Newcastle with Gaveston. The priory wasn't defended where she was, and it was exposed to capture by either Lancaster or the marauding Scots. Lancaster pursued the king toward Newcastle, but Gaveston returned to Scarborough thinking it was safe now. Well, it was safe from Lancaster, who was after the king. It wasn't safe from the Earl of Pembroke, who captured him. Pembroke promised to take him to London for trial and pledged his lands to the king to ensure Pierce's safety. Lancaster caught up with him and seized Gaveston from Pembroke, gave him a drumhead trial, forbidding him to speak, found him guilty, and cut his head off by proxy, I guess. Only if you go to slide 10, that is actually a picture of Lancaster doing it in person. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, here we get to rinse and repeat. Things settled down. Isabella was now over 20, and Edward welcomed her input on government. She worked harder than he did. She was smarter than he was, and he knew it. She was well treated, and she was wealthy. Edward, deprived of Gaveston, was voluntarily visiting her bed. She gave birth to 3 children, one each in the years 1316, 1318, and 1321. The first of these, a boy, was given to Gaveston's title, Earl of Cornwall, and the lands that went with it. All would have been well, but Edward didn't change his ways. He had no problem with the ordinances emasculating his role as king. He didn't like work. What are advisors for? Edward had advisors other than Isabella. Among them were a father and son pair, Hugh Despenser the elder and the younger. Gradually, Edward drew closer to Hugh the younger, who had, like Gaveston, been one of his childhood playmates. At first, he seemed to be an improvement on Gaveston. At least the family had been ennobled by Edward I. The honeymoon was short. The Despensers accumulated gifts from the king of other people's lands and castles. They enriched themselves by lawyering, swindling, and outright theft. At his apex, Hugh the Elder was the richest man in England. He dominated the council and deliberately showed his contempt for its members. The younger Hugh was a violent person, given to rages and physical assault. And now we get to slide 11, which is, tomb effigy of Hugh the Younger. Edward had subdued Scotland in 1296 and removed the crowning stone of Scone to London. The Scots did not stay long subdued. In 1297, William Wallace made life miserable for the occupiers, even raiding into England after he routed the English forces at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. For the following 8 years, invasions and maraudings back and forth were common. Wallace was succeeded by Robert the Bruce, who stuck a knife into his nearest rival and became king. And here is Robert the Bruce, tomb effigy. In 1314, Edward decided to be a military hero. Maybe second time he could get it right. The Despensers encouraged him. He raised a massive army and marched it to Bannockburn, north of the Firth of Forth. The battle fought there was a stunning victory for Scotland. The Scots lost 100 men. 700 knights or other soldiers who could afford armor died, and 500 more were captured. 11,000 of the infantry were killed, a fair percentage on the way home, as the Scots pursued the exhausted and disorganized survivors. Edward had fled early in the game, along with a small protecting guard. Bannockburn was the turning point that ultimately ensured Scotland's independence in 1328, and Edward's popularity was in the toilet. And here we have, going onward, the Battle of Bannockburn. And over here in the front, left, in the low left corner, we have the Scots on their knees praying. Somebody said, oh, they're praying for mercy. And He answered, no, they're praying for your head. And there is, you see that little wagon off in the right upper corner? That's Edward skiing away. Isabella had no children after 1321. This has been cited as evidence that Edward had turned away from her and was having sex with Hugh the Younger, which may be true, but Isabella remained a strong supporter of the king until she wasn't 3 or 4 years later. And here we have a pretty slide, the next slide, which is 14. And that is some flowers, which we will talk about. Despite the clergy's fire-breathing penalties for abortion, birth control was used and abortions took place in the 14th century, just like today. There were contraceptive measures in the form of vaginal suppositories, and if these failed, the go-to drugs were derived from hellebore and pennyroyal. The drugs were very risky, but so was giving birth at that time. Both plants are listed in my field guides as poisonous. Isabella had produced the heir, and after 2 failures, otherwise known as girls, the spare, and she might have decided that was enough. The Despencer War started with a dispute over an inheritance. The powerful Earl of Gloucester, one of the Marcher lords, had died without a formal will. Marcher refers to the border of Wales. Gloucester's 3 married daughters should have inherited each an equal 1/3 of his property, but Hugh the Younger married one of them and grabbed the very largest share and made it larger by seizing the portions of the other 2 sisters. Their husbands had been okay with Hugh's deportations as long as other people were the victims, but now they reconsidered their loyalty to the king and joined the Ordainers. Edward's failure to stop Hugh's seizures was a violation of them. The Marcher lords were all on board since Hugh had been a threat to all of them. And now we go to Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, right on the border of central Wales. He was the Earl of March, the obvious choice to lead the Marcher army. Until now, he'd been a strong supporter of the king. From his father's death in battle in 1304 to his emancipation in 1306, he'd been under the guardianship of none other than Piers Gaveston. He married at 14 Joan, a descendant of a Lusignan family who brought Roger extensive properties in Wales and Ireland. Besides these, Joan presented him with 14 children. He was a veteran of Bannockburn, and Edward had appointed him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1316, where he contributed to that country's already long list of grievances against the English occupiers. Despite Roger's prior loyalty, Edward had appropriated one of his estates and handed it to Hugh the Younger. That was an error. Mortimer led his fellow Marcher lords from Wales to London, burning and pillaging on the way. They surrounded the city and threatened to set fire to it. Lancaster and the Ordainers joined the party. In response, the Despensers were summoned to Parliament. They were blamed, and the charges against them were read out. Edward's hand was forced. He promised to exile them, but he delayed. According to one source, Earl Pembroke, from whom Gaveston had been seized by Lancaster, persuaded Isabella, he was always the peacemaker, to plead on her knees to Edward to make peace and actually exile him. She needed very little encouragement. Edward had made Hugh the Younger his chamberlain, a position that controlled access to the king, and he would even deny it to Isabella. Edward ignored her. He hated Lancaster for executing Gaveston, and he wanted to have done with the ordinances and their restraints. The Despensers were exiled, and Hugh the Younger became a pirate in the English Channel, murdering the crews of the vessels he looted, all no doubt with the connivance of the king. Despite the ongoing trouble with the Marcher lords, Isabella still appeared content. She had lands, income, and a wardrobe of jeweled court dresses and gold coronets. It wasn't until 1321 that her disaffection began. Edward continued his destructive course. He had the Archbishop of Canterbury lead the bishops into St. Paul's Cathedral and demand the revocation of the dispenser's exile on the grounds that the bishops hadn't been consulted and hadn't given their consent. The exile was annulled. The dispensers, who were secretly already back, surfaced immediately. On her way home from a pilgrimage to Canterbury, Isabella stopped at Leeds Castle, owned by Lord Badlesmere, and requested a night's shelter. The castle was out of the way, and Edward must have known that Badlesmere had been one of the leaders in the fight to have the dispensers exiled. So it's thought that he sent her there on purpose in hope of generating an excuse to attack Badlesmere and the Marchers. And here we have Leeds Castle, number 16. Badlesmere was away and his wife refused, though Isabella was entitled to shelter as the queen. All English real estate belonged either to clergy or ultimately to the king. Isabella tried to force an entrance, and several of her men were killed. Shocked to the core and frightened, she retired, and whether or not Edward had planned this, he gathered an army of 30,000 to avenge this insult to his queen. Isabella was far more popular than he was. He should have taken note. And then maybe we should look at the way Leeds Castle looks today. And if you want to get married there, here's slide 17. And today it is a wedding venue.
Is there a reason you're showing the same-sex marriage on the...
Because I'm sure that it was renting the place would be an inducement. The history would be an inducement.
Oh, okay, got it. But it's beautiful castle. Do you know if the is it? I mean, is it used as a museum right now, or this is just picturesque and it's just closed?
I don't know about the museum aspect. People live in these things, but I know you can rent they have a brochure and you can see all the inside in the brochure, and I'm sure they take people through. But you can rent as much of it as you want.
Okay, sorry.
Don't be sorry. Faced with overwhelming opposition, the picture with the young men is from their brochure, by the way. Faced with overwhelming opposition, the marchers had no choice but to surrender. Many of the marcher leaders were executed and their lands forfeited. Lancaster was beheaded along with 22 other nobles after a mass trial, during which they were forbidden to defend themselves. Mounted on a donkey, he was exhibited to a jeering crowd on his way to execution. Now, let's get up a slide of the Tower of London. Yes, we have it up. Mortimer was imprisoned in the Tower and condemned to death, but reprieved for 18 months for unknown reasons, and then given the earliest possible date for execution, the day after Lammastide of 1323. That's the harvest festival on which executions were prohibited in England. His wife and daughters were also made prisoners in the Tower, but the family was kept apart. On Lammastide, Mortimer escaped. His was the second escape since its construction in 1070, and the first since 1101. Despite some writers' speculation, Isabella had nothing to do with it. She and the king were still non-enemies. Lammastide prohibited executions, but not carousing. The whole Tower staff, from jailers to administrators, gathered in the main hall and downed their beer, which had been laced with additional sedation by Gerard d'Elspeth, a sub-lieutenant of the Tower. When the last of them lay senseless, d'Elspeth carried a rope ladder to Mortimer's cell and helped him and another prisoner loose the heavy stones of the exterior wall. The three men fled up a chimney, jamming their outstretched arms and legs between the walls, along the roof and down, using the rope ladder to the courtyard, then up and over the outer wall and down to Traitor's Gate. And I have a slide, which is 19, which is Traitor's Gate. And the Princess Elizabeth, soon to be Elizabeth I, was taken in through that gate, and she is reported to have refused to go in and just wept there. A boat was waiting for them downstream. At Greenwich, Mortimer was armed, and he sped on to Portchester, another boat for France and freedom. The escape had obviously been well organized. Who knows at what point Isabella gave up on Edward. Early in the Despencer tenure, she wrote to her brother complaining that someone was intruding on her marriage. Was it her dwindling contact with Edward despite her efforts to see him, or the meager gifts she received at long intervals instead of the steady stream during the years when the couple had been close? Was it memories of her abandonment at Tynemouth, left dangerously exposed while Edward fled from the Scots? The deliberately humiliating cut of her allowance to £1 per day? That's English pounds, not a weight. Okay, the final straw was his taking of her three younger children from her on the grounds she was a risk for treason. Modern biographers differ as to whether it actually happened, but then they tend to identify with their subject and take sides. The chroniclers took sides too. The most contemporary of them was Geoffrey the Baker, and he hated Isabella and loved Edward II. The accusation of treason grew out of Edward's ongoing refusal to pay homage for Gascony. Passive resistance had worked while Edward was still alive, but King Charles finally lost patience, declared the province forfeit, and sent troops to take it back. Edward sent troops to keep it. All people of French origin in England were suspect, like our Japanese in World War II, and that included Isabella. Her retainers were imprisoned, and she was forbidden to leave the country. She was now totally alone. Edward even petitioned the Pope for an annulment of his marriage, but the Pope was in Avignon, in the pocket of the French crown, not accessible to Edward's bribes. Edward withdrew the petition, but the damage was done. Now we get to Isabella, who is becoming the she-wolf of France. Isabella knew that it was endgame. Edward would find some reason to have her killed. She needed allies, and she needed to be elsewhere. Gascony, where the armies of France and England were snarling at each other across the battlefield, provided the excuse. Earl Pembroke, again the peacemaker, suggested she go to France and mediate a treaty. The Despensers protested. They said she couldn't be trusted, but Edward was still refusing point blank to make the trip. He was afraid he would be taken hostage. The Despensers weren't acceptable substitutes because it had to be royalty. Edward gave Isabella his consent to go to France and clean up the mess he'd made. Phew! As soon as Isabella reached Paris, she was surrounded by a group of disaffected English expats openly talking of rebellion. They told her about the common people's love for her and the support she could expect. Isabella gained confidence and realized she had to pry her son from Edward and get him to her in France. In England, he was a hostage for his good behavior. Edward knew that no matter how great Isabella's popularity might be, young Edward's was even greater. The English would acclaim an Edward III with all their hearts and lives if necessary. King Charles was aware of the same factors and salivating in anticipation of civil war with England. Civil war in England. So he graciously agreed to accept homage for Gascony from the Prince of Wales. Edward ignored the dispenser's warnings and sent the prince. Once Edward was safe in Paris, King Charles started to object to the details of the peace treaty and informed King Edward that Isabella would have to extend her stay. Then Jean of Hainault, a tiny part of Flanders that had grown phenomenally wealthy from maritime trade, arrived in Paris. And here is a map, in case anybody's curious. The map just shows that it's right near Brussels and isn't otherwise very useful. Jean took one look at young Edward and decided to play matchmaker. Here she had this lovely daughter, Philippa, back home. And wasn't Isabella's Edward a likely looking young man? Isabella should maybe bring him to, I know, we could get the two of them together, see what happens. And here we have what happened. Philippa at her wedding to the Prince of Wales. Isabella snapped at the bait. King Charles was getting tired of supporting his expensive guests since their subsidy from England had been cut off. Isabella promised she wouldn't allow Edward to marry while abroad, but since when had her husband ever kept a promise? Mother and son were soon on their way north to Hainault, where Edward met Philippa and found her enchanting, and vice versa. Nor was Edward the only one to find a partner. Roger Mortimer was also there, trying to put together an invasion of England. Isabella and Mortimer had met over the years. He had been one of Edward's noble playmates. He'd carried in the royal robes, which was an honor at Edward's coronation, and fought in Edward's army, if not with Edward, who was usually too busy running away. From that moment, everything went right. Jean was over the moon about her daughter becoming Queen of England one day. Partnership with England would do wonders for both countries' economies. Hainault had plenty of money, and neither Roger nor Isabella had much, but Isabella's father, King of France, could see the benefit of backing her, especially as she would be partnered by a man with an impressive military resume and mostly financed by Hainault. Of course, there was a flurry of messages to and from. Isabella offered Edward I a last opportunity to ditch the dispensers, and her missive explained just how their domination of her husband had so injured her. It is a revelation to read the reply. The gaslighting is off the charts. After he stated that he didn't believe she disliked Hugh Dispenser, I guess she hadn't made it clear enough, he wrote, "The king knows the truth, and she knows that Hugh has always procured her all the honor with the king that he could, and no evil or villainy was done to her after her marriage by any abatement or procurement, unless sometimes the king addressed her in secret words of reproof by her own fault, if she will remember, as was befitting." So she was the one to blame. The scary thing is that King Edward may actually have believed this, unless it was written and sent by Dispenser himself. It may have been. Was the king delusional, or had the Dispensers kept him that far out of touch with what was being done in his name? They may have intercepted her message. Isabella had begged on her royal knees for Edward to get them gone, and that was just one incident on one occasion. Nevertheless, she managed to achieve a truce between the French and English armies in Gascony. It was heavily slanted towards French interests, yes, but Edward had no choice but to sign. King Edward started to go after the relatives of Mortimer and Isabella, but he was somewhat reluctant to kill or torture his own kids, and Mortimer's mother showed that she possessed the same talent as her son by disappearing after Edward issued a warrant for her arrest. Joan Mortimer was still a prisoner, but Edward had probably been informed that her hostage value wasn't high these days. A lot of ink has been spilled speculating on when Isabella and Mortimer became lovers. They had to be very careful not to spoil her image as a virtuous wrong woman. She announced publicly that the Dispensers had destroyed her marriage and then adopted the black veiled garb of a 14th century French widow, and the two were careful to maintain the demeanor of fellow soldiers in a righteous cause. However, there's no question that at some point they did it, to use the ancient phrase. Isabella had been publicly rejected and demeaned by the man who swore to love her, and Mortimer was tall and handsome and separated from his wife for the previous 5 years. Roger was 4 years younger than Isabella, who was still stunningly beautiful, and he knew that England would flock to his standard were Isabella beside him with her son. Mortimer promised an end to her humiliations. Come on, ladies, what would you have done? Take 3 seconds and think hard. And over here seems like a good time where I can have a drink and preserve my voice, and maybe someone else can speak for a second if there's anybody having a bit of discussion.
I will unmute people. If you have any questions, we can at least kind of have a discussion, whatnot. There was a couple of things that I wanted to say that from the chat that we have. So Kathy has pointed out that actually William Wallace was not called Braveheart. Braveheart. It was Robert the Bruce who was called Braveheart. So I guess it was just an interesting distinction. Also, to the question why there was such a hatred toward Jews is Vicky had pointed out that a lot of the royals had borrowed money from Jews, but during the having so many dukes that were as strong or sometimes having bigger armies than the king, the feudal relationship was very interesting. At any point, somebody, like as you have shown, the Lancaster can rise up and defeat the king. So they had to go and borrow money from the Jews to, obviously, to conduct campaign versus Scotland, which was many, and his father was much more successful than Edward at the time. And then when they didn't want to give it back the money, they declared that the Jews poisoned the water, killed children, whatever lies that there was an interesting case in Tsar's Russia. I forget the name of the Jewish lieutenant that was accused, an Ashkenazi Jew who was accused of the one of the children in Ukraine disappearing, and therefore one of the major pogroms that was happening. But there were so many pogroms in Russia, so this was happening in Europe, and obviously ending a very sad note where Hitler had such an interesting we're talking about many centuries later, but there was obviously a lot of people didn't almost never notice. And recently I've read that UN, at that time there was no UN. I mean, it was League of Nations and United States and Great British knew about the Holocaust, knew about this different camps that Germans had built, but knowingly not letting a lot of the Jewish refugees in the countries that were escaping the persecution of Jews, and also not letting the Germans know that they can read the codes, the secret codes that Germans had passed. So there was a lot of silence. So obviously you can imagine the 14th, 15th century was even worse for Jews. Whenever the king wanted to declare that he didn't want to give the money, he would basically just say the Jews did this, Jews did that, and here you go. They throw him out of England. I think one of the first ones. Then France, then obviously Isabella and the Castile, very famous, Inquisition. Later in 15th century through conversos. So it's just it kind of like bad habits die very slowly. And in some cases, we have a 20th century that had happened where 6 million Jews perished because of a lot of this really things that's been happening. So anybody wants to when you want any questions? One thing I have a question for you, Jane, is
Okay.
so Isabella, before she had a child, and obviously she was 16 or 17 at the time, and then unbeknownst to us, people only lived an average of 35 years of life, with 40 years of life, wherever it was, because of the fact that there was a lot of wars and people were dying. But she was not considered to be legitimate until she had a child. I mean, how difficult was life for a woman during those times? Like, she's a queen, right? She's supposed to be
Yes.
legitimate. Here he is having menage a trois, or whatever you just called it, with another man. He's enjoying himself. She's considered illegitimate because she didn't have a child, and she's 16 years old. What is there to do? I mean, it must be like so scary for presumably a teenager, a child at the time. And what was life for women at the time? What could contemporaries say? I mean, we go from Greeks and Romans. Obviously during the Greeks, women were almost unnoticed. During the Roman time, they had a little bit more rights, but we don't know any Greek or Roman kings or queen. All the queens, from those times. We know Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, but there was no, you know, Caesar woman or something like that, or Augustus lady, or some king, the Leonidas, whatever. I mean, there was no women queens and kings during those times. So I guess, was it something that was fed from ancient times, and rights of women and all that stuff? Um, can you speak about their, how what was their predicament those times? Sorry.
Uh, Actually, it varied a lot. It varied by country. It varied by social class. Uh, Women were very active and they participated. I mean, all peasants, male or female, were pretty miserable at this time. And, eh, it's just too hard to generalize. They didn't have, in general, the kind of rights that they have now, but it wasn't particularly awful compared to, what men didn't have a lot of rights unless they were nobility. So it's hard to say, at least for me.
So basically, once she started having children, she was like, okay, well, now I can move. I mean, it almost reminds me of Catherine the Great of Russia, right? A
Yes,
young,
exactly.
young girl of, 16, 17, arriving from Germany, marrying this sycophantic, Prussian loving, king, Pavel. And then in the end, I think it took about 3 to 4, I mean, even 5 years for her to legitimize herself, learn Russian, change orthodoxy from
Yeah.
Catholic Lutheranism, whatever, Lutheran religion, and then becoming more of a power. So it's like almost a process. Like, first you have to have a child, then you have to convert or adapt yourself. Considering, right, France and England was almost like as one, because the language was almost the same. I think Richard Leinhardt didn't never even spoke English, from what I heard.
Yeah. It, I, as I said, it's something I would never give an opinion on because it's just too darn um, varied. Women exerted power from the side as they always have been, and women were powerful as abbesses, and through the religion they had some fame. There were women like Eleanor of Aquitaine were enormously powerful if they were regents, and they frequently were. So again, I pass.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, shall I go on?
Yes, I don't see any questions. I think we're probably gonna, see if questions come up or any kind of comments. I will read them to you later, but you go ahead.
Okay, all right. By September of 1327, the invading force was assembled thanks to Count William of Hainault. There were 95 ships, 5 warships, 15 cogs, and on slide 22, you will see the cog, which is a beautiful little ship. It's actually a 14th century freighter, 45 fishing boats, and 29 other. Between 900 to 1,500 fighters embarked with horses, arms, armor, ready to take on England. So here's a drawing. Again, Isabella and Mortimer set sail for England. The mini armada landed on the territory of the Earl of Norfolk, a rabid opponent of the Despensers. Edward II had anticipated that they would land there and ordered a defending fleet there. But the fleet got lost, his fleet, somehow on the way. He gave orders to mobilize 50,000 men. Wow, promising pardon to criminals and murderers who joined. When have I heard that recently? The nobles responsible for assembling this horde, ignored him. Henry of Lancaster, whose brother Thomas had been executed by King Edward, sent troops in support of the invaders. Okay, and here we have slide 24, which shows pretty much where they landed in respect to London. And they were going to go from Bury St. Edmunds Abbey or Walton over here. That was only Isabella over there. And over to London, which is a distance of 83 miles, which is nothing at all for an army. Roger sent the boats back. That was a tactic used since 1066 to make retreat impossible. It wasn't necessary. After the first night's welcome in the Earl of Norfolk's castle, Isabella stayed in the Benedictine monastery of Bury St. Edmunds. Her real religious devotion and frequent pilgrimages to Canterbury, only some of which were a cover for her letters, had enhanced her reputation for piety. And although she was rebelling against her wedded law, his sins were witness against her. God was obviously on her side, and the bishops of England joined him there. As for King Edward's hastily assembled and ill-supplied army, much of it never mustered, and those who did respond either arrived when everything was over or were unable to locate the invaders as they marched the 83 miles. Towards London through crowds of cheering supporters, many fell into step and joined their march. They turned off the London road midway to chase the king, now headed for Wales, where Edward thought he would find support beyond the marches. Nope. The Welsh hated him too. He and Hugh the Elder found a boat intending to cross the Irish Sea, but they made no headway against adverse winds. See, God was really against them. And finally turned back. Despenser abandoned him. Nobody paid any attention to the king's last demand for soldiers. Even his household servants back in London ran away, lest they be slaughtered in what everyone knew was coming. In London, there were riots in support of the invaders, a few lynchings, vindictive after the years of misrule. The head of Walter de Stapleton, a long-time enemy of Isabella, was given to her when she arrived in London. And here's Isabella on slide 25, entering London. And I don't believe she's being given the head in this particular slide, maybe on the other side of the wall. The kingdom also had no head. Edward hadn't bothered to appoint a regent or a custodian. The obvious solution was at hand, and the 14-year-old Prince of Wales was named custodian with Isabella as his regent. Hugh the Elder was caught and lynched, hanged, cut down alive, and then beheaded for the extrajudicial killing of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, among his other crimes. Nobody would carry King Edward's pleas for him to London. The invaders demanded unconditional surrender. Edward tried again to flee, and Henry of Lancaster, brother of Thomas, caught him together with Hugh the Younger. And now we come to the aftermath. And we go on to slide 26. And if you feel like it, you can pass quickly to the next slide. It's kind of awful to look at it. It was time to return to the rule of law. Hugh the Younger was given a trial before undergoing a horrible execution that started with his genitals being cut off and burned in front of him. Deposing the king was easy. Roger had the mayor of London call a meeting of the people at which the charges against Edward II were enumerated. Any reluctance to depose one of the anointed by God was blown away by the fiery rhetoric of Bishop Orleton. With London behind him, Roger called a parliament. The charges against Edward were read out, and the vote with deposition was practically unanimous. The last finality was to secure his abdication. A delegation was sent to him at Kenilworth Castle, where he was confronted with his judgment. Weeping and sobbing, he actually resigned. He wrote pathetic letters to Isabella, begging for her company. She received her dower lands at last, which Edward had withheld from her time of marriage. But she got them from Prince Edward, now 15 years of age. These gave her a yearly income of the equivalent of about 10 million USD. She was the richest queen of England so far. Queen Elizabeth II got 100 million in her last year. Edward III granted Isabella additional lands and castle, bringing her 5 million more per year. In the beginning, Mortimer proved a good steward of the state. His grants were mostly to those who'd helped in the invasion or the return of lands Edward II had unjustly seized, his own among them. Mortimer was a hard-working, competent administrator. There were some personal conundrums to work out. Joan Mortimer had been released from the Tower, but she wasn't with Roger. At one point, she and Isabella and Mortimer were carelessly booked into the same castle at the same time. Fortunately, there were 2 separate bedroom wings. Mortimer sent her books and other presents, but Isabella had definitely supplanted her. Then there was Scotland. The Battle of Bannockburn had clearly shown that England couldn't continue its occupation and couldn't afford an increasingly futile struggle. Isabella and Mortimer negotiated the Treaty of Northampton, granting Scotland independence and promising no further military action if Scotland kept her raiders home. Prince Edward wasn't asked, and he was livid at what he saw as a humiliation for his country happening under his watch. He wasn't king yet, but Isabella also suffered because her little daughter Joan, age 7, wished to be married to David Bruce and live beyond the borders of what she thought a savage, violent land. That all English thought that, and they were no strangers to savagery themselves. What to do about Edward II? Killing an anointed monarch was a fearsome step. Think of how long Elizabeth I endured Mary Stuart's plot before she finally had her executed for that reason. But Mortimer was well aware that wheels can turn full circle. Memories are short. If the populace that cheered the end of Edward II's reign became disenchanted with Mortimer and Isabella, a movement to restore him might arise. As long as he lived, Isabella and Mortimer would have to continue their charade, lest she be accused of criminal adultery against an anointed king. Isabella sent Edward through 2 books and other gifts in the early months of his imprisonment. Why? Possibly the gaslighting was working, as it does, or people wouldn't use it. Perhaps she wanted to reduce the suspicion of her sexual involvement with Mortimer, or maybe a decision to the king had already been taken, and she wanted to establish evidence she hadn't wanted him dead. For centuries, it was accepted that Edward's jailers had pinned him in bed with an inverted table or cushions. Then, in order to hide the burns that would result, inserted the mouth end of a horn into his anus, shoved a red-hot poker through it, and burnt out its internal organs. The body was washed, exhibited, and given a real cool tomb in Gloucester Cathedral, which is illustrated on slide 27. That's back one slide. There we are. A letter emerged sent from Rome by a Cardinal Fieschi that claimed Edward II had escaped from Berkeley Castle with the help of a servant and was now alive and well in Italy. The body so attentively prepared for burial was that of a porter Edward killed during his escape. Apparently, he'd been bobbing around Europe at courts, visiting all kinds of royalty. There was a flurry of interest, but ultimately nothing came of it. To me, the Fieschi letter sounds exactly like the beginning of a Facebook scam. Modern popular biographers love the Fieschi letter, but if Edward wanted to let his son know he was alive, he could have written to him himself. And the idea that he went from one royal court to another and nobody recognized him is pretty silly. Whether or not Edward II was alive, the Prince of Wales was turning 18 and wanted to be king, and free of Mortimer's restraints on him. Mortimer had become rapacious in his turn, and his victims wanted justice. Henry of Lancaster tried to overthrow him. The attempt was unsuccessful, but the wheel was turning. Sometime in October of 1330, Mortimer had the Earl of Kent arrested, and then was consumed with anger. He realized that he had to act. When William of Montague suggested that Edward stage a coup before he himself was killed, he put it this way: better to eat the dog than have the dog eat you. Edward agreed. And in slide 28, we have Northampton Castle. In November, Mortimer, Isabella, and Edward were staying there. No doubt they felt secure. The castle was on a vertical ridge and well guarded. It sure looks it. But William of Montague, a supporter of the king, knew of a secret passage. A supporter of Edward knew of a secret passage to the interior, and he infiltrated with 23 conspirators, all armed. Edward had told them where Mortimer and Isabella would be sleeping, and Montague's men seized Mortimer while Isabella pleaded for his life. Edward sent Mortimer to London and a trial in Parliament. Bystanders gathered along the road, but this time they jeered as he walked by. The trial was a formality, and Mortimer was executed on Tyburn Hill. And our last slide is Hereford Castle. Eleanor and Edward III, her son, grew closer in the years that followed. She forgave him the murder of her lover. Her daughter, Queen Joan of Scotland, rejoined her after discovering that David Bruce, her husband, was repeatedly unfaithful to her. Isabella played with her grandchildren, and Edward and Philippa's kids, and joined the lay branch of the Franciscans with the habit concealed beneath her clothes. She died August 22nd, 1358, at Hereford Castle after a brief illness. And that's my talk. Any questions?
Jane, incredible. Thank you so much. I guess one question I have is this executions. Like, I mean, you were just mentioning it, with Edward and Gavison and her lover. I mean, and I know she asked Edward to spare. Um, I guess after they execute him, they also, or before they execute him, they cut the genitals, they quadruple, whatever the quartering them. Like it's just ridiculous. Like, why torture? Just take their head off. You prove the point. What is this torture before and after person get executed? Now, obviously, people probably have seen the series on Henry VIII. Like he was torturing all his um quote unquote lovers of his ex-wives before he executed his ex-wives, and would put their heads on the pike to. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just the times. I mean, what was the purpose of it? I mean, why were they doing it?
The purpose was very definitely to humiliate them. And also, a lot of these guys were soldiers and they had faced death on the battlefield and it held no terrors for them anymore. So cutting their head off neatly would really not have been for them much of a punishment. They wouldn't sit there anticipating being dead. They would basically be saying, all right, it's over. Okay, I've had a good one. Now it's over. They wanted to make sure there was a degree of suffering, but that was a side issue. It was almost completely a question of humiliating them. And also, I think there is something in the Christian religion for many people that if the body, that if the body is mutilated, you can't be resurrected. That might have been part of it too.
What was the Catholic Church and Pope in all this, especially with Edward II and openly having a relation with Gavison? Or they were at that time it was just too far, don't care, ignorance is a bliss type of thing. Um,
I don't quite understand. You mean why wasn't there clerical
what
outrage?
was there any edict that was issued and saying replace him, invade, let's do the crusade on England. The king is, you know, doing unchristian thing or whatnot. Um, was the Pope had that kind of power? Obviously, with crusades, he had the power, right? With Richard Lionheart 100 years earlier going to Jerusalem, stuff like that. But was there any of it could reverse and go into one of the you know European countries and say we're going to install a rightful uh,
I see what you mean. Um, no, they were definitely um, separate from the secular part.
let's see. Anybody has any questions they want to? This is incredible talk, and I apologize for all the technical issues, mostly on my part. Um,
No, it wasn't you. What it was, you sent me the link. And when I used that link instead of going through the meetup site, um, apparently I found in my email that they were very alarmed about this. And was this really me? And they were afraid that I was going to be one of those people who do, what they do. So that was the whole story of the problem.
yeah. Okay. Well, next time we'll just, I guess, we'll do like maybe a day before, kind of like a
Yeah.
mock type of thing. Anybody has any? I'm mute everybody. I mean, if you have a question, either raise your hand or speak or hold your peace. 1 second. Almost like I'm at the wedding or something. I was called to mute, so I've asked everybody to. I mean, if you just have a general opinion about what do you think about the Isabella and Edward. they're called they're called so many Edwards, 3 Edwards in a row. Um,
I was wondering, do they think of Isabella as a villain or a heroine? Which
well, if they
which
call
one?
her, if they call her, what did you call? What do they call her? The
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 she
the
wolf of
the she
France.
wolf. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how that is a good name. You know, like I'm going to be doing a presentation on Irma Hart, who was called hyena of Auschwitz. Obviously, you know, it's not a good name, right? I mean, anybody's called after a animal name. You know, no pun intended on animal. So I
Well,
mean,
you see, even though she's kind of, you know, if you're a feminist, she's a heroine because she stood up to the abuse she was getting in her marriage. And if you're um, disapproving of people using being the king to steal everything they can get their hands on and mess up the whole country, she's a heroine for saving them from Edward II. And okay, Mortimer went bad, but she didn't know that at the time. And that was years later anyway. So by me, she qualifies as a heroine. If some people want to call her a she-wolf, okay, but I don't.
well, obviously, it was a very misogynistic type of environment, right? The woman stood up, rebelled, but they were looking all the negatives, right?
Yeah.
So she had a lover openly walking around parading, you know, dressed nice. She bankrupted English, you know, um, you know, coffins, you know, to say the least. Um, and then when she was deposed by her son, she was just like this nice go around bubbly personality in court. Um,
Mhm.
at one point, asked to return all of her lovers, you know, possessions to his kids. You know, so it's um, yeah, she did what she did, and then you know, and then it kind of people don't notice negative stuff.
Yeah.
Somebody has a question. Where was this? Okay, Susan Schmidt. Where was Isabella buried, and why was she known as Isabella, Spanish or Italian, rather than a French Isabelle?
Why was she known as Isabella?
Versus Isabel, which is different
Yeah,
pronunciation.
you know, that's a very good question. And I assume that she's in Westminster Abbey, but I have no idea whether she actually is or not. I didn't check her burial. I'm sorry.
Westminster Abbey. Wow, interesting, interesting. I mean, don't didn't they bury like Richard the Lionheart, the Edward, the you know Henry, all that kind of like next to each other and stuff in
Well,
Abbey? Yeah.
uh, her husband, he was buried in Gloucester Cathedral. That's where his tomb is. So she might have been buried there as well, you know, as a possibility. But I really didn't look. I can check it on Google at very much.
No, but yeah, we can. But the interesting is, what do you think of Plantagenets and their rule of England? I mean, were they really that um, you know important to then you know establishment of England? What is in general is your thought? I mean, why wouldn't she just grab the power for herself? Why did she have to put her 4 year old son and kind of rule through you know through him with her lover? Uh, what do you think about the Plantagenets in general?
Is that for me or is that for the group?
For you and the group, if anybody
Oh,
wants.
oh, okay. Uh, you know, I really don't uh, have too much opinions on these things because, well, Henry III is considered a good guy. Edward II is considered a bad guy. Edward III was a good guy because of Crecy and the other big battles that he won. And that was basically the end of it, wasn't it? And
Yep,
uh,
that's it.
yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, she's buried at Christ Church Greyfriars Churchyard in London.
Anybody has any other questions? Or people are muted. I know Patty, you always have good comments. You want to join the talk? What do you think about Isabella? What do you think?
It's interesting. I was a little frustrated because I don't have sufficient background knowledge to really be following everything that Jane was telling us well. But I also had just typed into the chat, Robert has a program going on in a few minutes on the Prado, and I need to leave now to join that. But
Okay.
Thank you, Jane.
That was
You have me inspired to try to understand more about it, especially with the cross references to the Robert the Bruce and all that. So I'm trying to couch it in the right era in history, and I'm not doing a good job today.
Well, there are so many tempting side journeys you can make from this. But one of the takeaways that I found from doing research is that it's very hard. There was so much going on that it's really hard to keep a chronology going. I had to jump forward and back because, Battle of Stirling, Battle of Bannockburn, which one was associated with which and so forth. It was driving me nuts.
Well, that helps. It's good to know that I'm not alone, because that, for me, that is like a salient feature in trying to understand history and how human beings do the things they do, is trying to be able to place it in the broader history as much as I can. And I just didn't feel like I had the right background for this. When Zach had originally posted the survey, I was at a loss. I knew nothing about Edward and Isabella. So I was looking forward to at least gaining a broader knowledge of who we were talking about.
Yes, I mean, you run through the battles, and then all of a sudden you have to go back to the marriage, because at the same time these things were going on, and as I said, it was was a pain.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have to bid you farewell, but thank you again, Jane, for another very interesting program. I appreciate all the effort you go to.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, Jane is incredible. And we're gonna have to think about the next one, Jane. Oh, by the way, on the 24th, if anybody wants to join, we're gonna do another update on Ukrainian war, and we have a couple of other interesting programs. If anybody wants to talk about ancient language, ancient civilizations, we have one coming up with Beverly. And we're going to talk about the Iranian history and the particular history of the Medes and early Archimedeans. If anybody knows Cyrus the Great, his grandfather was, a Mede, which is the tribe, obviously, that where the Iranian people, or first Archimedean empire, basically took their roots from.
Did you already post the Ukraine and the
No,
Ukraine program in this one? The one?
No, I will. I'll post. Richard usually takes care of it. He's working on the kinks right now. And then if anybody is in New York or wants to join, and Jane will be there. If you guys want to meet Jane in person, we're going to be actually watching a movie together on October 28th, a month from now. The movie is called Prince of Foxes, and after that, we hang out and talk about it. It's a 15th century Venice, an interesting movie. We'll watch it, and we'll have a discussion. And while we're watching, we order food, drinks, whoever, it's very open type of. And then we meet our presenters. There's going to be a couple of presenters there: Greg, Jane, hopefully Paul, and Richard. Thank you. And then
goodbye for now. Thank you.
All right, Jane. Thank you so much. If you guys don't have any more questions, I want to let you guys go. And Jane, so much incredible presentation as usual. Let's talk about the next one. It'd be awesome to talk about next ones as well.
All right. If anybody ever wants to do a language one and is willing to associate with the Festus disc, I'd be happy to listen to it. Maybe you can persuade someone.
I will. I will. I have John Maloney does language presentations. Let me just talk to him. See if
Yeah,
he's
don't be ready for getting laughed in your face, but go ahead. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.